I am the future that was born 100 years ago. I am the purpose that emerged with India's independence to be a force for business that makes doing good our business. Towards an independence where knowledge sets us free. To think big and achieve bigger. To take India to the world and the world to India. Creating pathways of self-reliance. To stand for progress, the planet and the people. Towards a future made perfect. And be a force creating abundance. Because independence is not a moment in history. It's a never-ending path to prosperity. Aditya Birla Group, a force for good.
कस्टमर लॉयल्टी रिवॉर्ड 55 इंच का टीवी 4,999 रुपए में. Too good to be true.
Unknown company, unknown sender. यानी पक्का स्कैम. केस सॉल्व.
करेक्ट. स्कैम के खिलाफ गूगल के साथ आओ. स्कैम पहचानो, मौका कमाओ.
Imagination in flight begins with a sheet of paper, a couple folds, and a simple throw. But for some, the exhilaration and wonder behind flight never fades. At GE Aerospace, we turn what-ifs into what's next. Because when the right idea catches the wind, there's no limit to how far the next generation will go.
In every step, there's a spark of joy. A little sparkle, through laughter, through friendship, through streets that tell 1,000 stories. With Bata, make your way to the moments that matter with Brighter Moments collection. This festive season, style begins at ₹799. Bata, make your way. Visit your nearest Bata store.
On the rise, सुन ले आसमां, डबल इंजन का ये मिशन है महान. 2047 तक हम न रुकेंगे, 6 ट्रिलियन का ड्रीम पूरा करेंगे. मथुरा की गलियों में गूंजे है राधा, अयोध्या में दूर हुई मंदिर की बाधा, काशी प्रयागराज की गोल्डन चमक, यूपी सरकार की गूंजे धमक. सड़कों पर फर्राटा फिक्रलेस बिल्कुल बिंदास, एक्सप्रेस वे पर साइंस आए पूरा विश्वास. विकसित यूपी की बढ़ गई प्यास, 2047 का ये विजन बहुत खास. माफिया का दी एंड, फियर गॉन, योगी राज में लॉ एंड ऑर्डर हुआ स्ट्रॉन्ग. बेखौफ घूमे जनता, गुंडों पर मार, नया यूपी तोड़ रहा पुरानी दीवार. यूपी ऑन द राइज, सुन ले आसमां, डबल इंजन का ये मिशन है महान. 2047 तक हम न रुकेंगे, 6 ट्रिलियन का ड्रीम पूरा करेंगे.
Blessed with breathtaking natural beauty, vibrant tribal culture, and rich heritage its identity. Where there are vast reserves of mineral wealth, the new growth engine of New India. writing a new saga of development under good governance. Chhattisgarh, a state like no other, from Bastar to Sarguja. Chhattisgarhiya, sable badhiya.
NPS वात्सल्य ये किसने दिया?
ये हमने दिया है। सभी चाहते हैं अपने बच्चों की आज की नहीं कल की जरूरतों को भी पूरा करें। इसीलिए हमने चुना है NPS वात्सल्य, जो सालाना 1000 रुपए के निवेश से भी शुरू हो जाता है।
NPS वात्सल्य आप 18 वर्ष तक के बच्चों के लिए ले सकते हैं, जो 18 वर्ष बाद खुद ही NPS अकाउंट में कन्वर्ट हो जाएगा।
इसीलिए कहता हूँ हर उम्र के लिए NPS जरूरी है।
There are moments in a nation's journey when the sunlight awakens a new dawn of possibilities. As India stood at a crossroad of need and possibility, REC emerged, not as a company, but as a quiet resolve. REC was incorporated to resurrect the agriculture sector by energizing irrigation pump sets, marking a giant leap for the Indian agrarian economy. Since then, we have diversified into new technologies and financed over 100,000 megawatt of energy. We are now one of the biggest financial institutions in the country, funding generation, transmission, distribution, and renewable energy projects. The future is now, and we are constantly reinventing ourselves to stay ahead of the times.
As India strides towards the vision of Viksit Bharat at 2047, CGEW-HO stands committed to building not just homes, but a foundation of dignity, welfare, and inclusive progress for the backbone of our nation, our central government employees. This year's theme, Urban Solutions to Crisis, speaks directly to the heart of CGEW-HO's mission, a mission they've upheld for over 35 years, and that is to serve those who serve the nation. From its inception, CGEW-HO has seen housing not just as infrastructure, but as a right, a vital foundation for inclusive and dignified urban living. With a pan-India footprint, CGEW-HO has successfully delivered quality housing projects across the nation, from metros to emerging cities, ensuring that central government employees have access to secure and affordable homes wherever duty takes them.
दिल को मोरे दिल में बसे रो ऐसी मोहक छवि बनाए ऐसी मोहक छवि बनाए नैनन
say that dedicated freight corridor is the jewel of Indian Railways.
India dreamt of a new future with a faster, safer and smarter freight network. A vision to create a dedicated pathway for the nation's lifeline, its cargo. That vision became a mission. Dedicated freight corridors.
उगती हुई हरियाली में, सोने सी हर बाली में, हर सुबह चाय की प्याली में और घर घर की खुशहाली में, प्रदूषण मुक्त हो आसमान, दुनिया भर में अपने निशान, आत्मनिर्भर हिंदुस्तान, गेल इंडिया जिसकी पहचान।
Every great journey begins with a resolute step. India's journey in infrastructure started with early recognition of its importance, which gained traction from the mid-2000s onwards. Established in 2006 by the Government of India, India Infrastructure Finance Company Limited or IIFCL finances key infrastructure projects from roads and power to renewable energy, airports, seaports and urban development. IIFCL, funding foundation of the future.
तू ही मेरी एक वजह है, तू ही मेरी ऊर्जा है, तू ही मेरी राहों का नूर, तू मेरा फ्यूल तुझी से मैं चलता हूँ, तेरे लिए जलता हूँ, तुझी से मैं हुआ मशहूर।
उत्तर के पहाड़ों से दक्षिण के किनारों तक, पहले इंडियन फिर ऑयल, इंडियन ऑयल।
प्लीज विद्या मेरी मदद कर दे। पर मेरा स्कूल बैग उठाना पड़ेगा। पक्का। स्कूल प्रोजेक्ट बनाना है ग्रीन एनर्जी पर, और मुझे कुछ नहीं पता। ग्रीन एनर्जी मतलब रिन्यूएबल एनर्जी, जैसे सोलर और विंड एनर्जी।
With the aim to achieve half of installed capacity from clean energy sources, we are creating a greener future because every step we take nature along.
मेरा बैग।
From oil-rich lands where dreams ignite, Oil India Limited fuels the nation day and night. As India's flag bearer in oil and natural gas exploration, we have been powering dreams for over 60 years. With operations spanning 7 countries, we drive industries, energize economies, and spark innovation. Rooted in legacy, committed to sustainability, we are building futures, uplifting communities, and empowering generations. A Maharatna of India, proud and true. Oil India Limited, energizing lives for you.
RVNL today has evolved into a global infrastructure powerhouse, laying the foundations of a future-ready India. From railways to metros, from highways to harbors, from tunnels to solar power, RVNL is transforming the infrastructure landscape across India and beyond. From concept to commissioning, Rail Vikas Nigam Limited, empowering progress, delivering excellence.
Welcome to the second day of the HT Leadership Summit. Our theme, Transforming Tomorrow, continues to guide us as we delve deeper into the ideas and forces shaping the future. As we gather for another day of thought-provoking conversations, let us move forward together on this journey of change, innovation, and possibility. For our first guest and session, we have Edward Luce. He's the Chief U.S. commentator at the Financial Times. As one of the most respected voices on American politics and global affairs, Luce has held key roles at the Financial Times, including U.S. National Editor, Washington Bureau Chief, South Asia Bureau Chief, and Capital Markets Editor, and previously served as speechwriter to U.S. Treasury Secretary Larry Summers in the Clinton administration. A best-selling author whose works have shaped public discourse on geopolitics and the future of Western democracies, he is also a prominent media presence across major global networks. To moderate this session, we have with us Kaveri Bamzai.
I have a wonderful guest here today, someone who's pretty well known in India and, of course, in the rest of the world. Welcome to the Hindustan Times Leadership Summit, the virtual edition. I have with me Ed Luce, who's the U.S. commentator of the Financial Times, and he's just written a remarkable new book on the name that I always stumble upon, Zbigniew Brzezinski. And it's actually very timely given what's happening in the world. And he was, I think, the last of the Cold Warriors and the last of the political strategists who really thought very deeply about the world and where it's going. Ed Luce is perfectly positioned in Washington. He's been there for about 2 decades. He's seen many presidents, but none, I imagine, as entertaining perhaps as Donald Trump, the second time round. So I have to begin by asking you, Ed, if I may call you that, what really is Trump's Washington all about?
Oh, that's a big question. It's all about Trump, I think, would be the first answer. He is the master of news cycle domination. A news cycle, as you know, isn't 24 hours anymore. It's 15-minute increments, and he's got escalation dominance. I think it would be fair to say over news. Everything is about Trump, and the way that politics works is in reaction to Trump. And as long as it's Trump causing the reaction, then Trump controls the narrative. And so Washington is, even in a way that wasn't true during Trump's first term, Washington is really, Trumpistan. And now that might be changing, and we can get into what I think is already a sort of battle for the Trump succession that's going on. But for the time being, this is a unique phenomenon, really, in American history. It's a personalist, one-man administration in which he's at the top of a pyramid, and everybody beneath him in the pyramid owes their position to absolute loyalty to Trump, and no deviation from that is permitted. And this is a very strange and new thing in American democracy.
Precisely. And you cannot imagine a man like Zbigniew Brzezinski being there now, right? I mean, Trump would never take advice from someone who didn't agree with him, basically.
He would not. I mean, Brzezinski, operated not that long ago, but it feels like a different age, in competition with the likes of Henry Kissinger. Debates about what America's grand strategy ought to be. And Kissinger, served Nixon and Ford, and Brzezinski served Carter. But Brzezinski would disagree very strongly with Carter. They would have open arguments, and sometimes Carter would climb down. It's just inconceivable that you would be anything other than out of the room and never invited back if you oppose Donald Trump. He requires constant sort of reinforcement, ego massage, echo chamber. He does not tolerate dissent, and he's not really interested in ideas about strategy. I mean, there isn't really a Trump foreign policy strategy. It's the wrong word. I think that's a form of sane washing. There is what Trump does, and we can try and sort of build a pattern out of that, but he will make your pattern irrelevant and redundant within an hour of you finishing it.
So what really are the elements of Trumpistan? And if one were to look at Trumpistan, as against the rest of the world, is there a foreign policy, as you said, or is it just domestic politics which is driving the foreign policy?
So those who attempt to, what I say, sane wash, to provide a sort of school of thought to Trumpian foreign policy, would call it sort of the American greatness, America first project. And they would see this as ultra realist, namely that there are no sort of values or principles to Trump's foreign policy, such as you've seen in very different ways through Democratic and Republican presidents for 80 years. There is just there's just the power of America's might and the sense that the world is a jungle and that America is the biggest predator, and it has respect as such for other predators, which have their own sections of the jungle, namely China and Russia. And America's section is the Western Hemisphere, but also the transatlantic world, in which it can do what it likes, but it respects the raw might of the other predators, as I say, chiefly China and Russia. And you can dress that up as a sort of ultra realist. I wouldn't call it isolationist, but you can say it's a sort of ultra realist and unromantic doctrine based on the idea of raw power. But Trump doesn't sort of consistently act according to that script. So I'm very skeptical. I think Trump's foreign policy is what Trump does. And what Trump does deviates quite a bit from that sort of idealized description of what his philosophy is, and is driven a lot more by opportunities to make money, personalist ties with other regimes and other countries that operate like Trump operates. And so where there is not really much distinction between public and private. So you'll see him getting along better with Pakistan, for example, than with India, because India is still a rules-based system. You'll see him getting along better with Qatar and Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates than with Canada or even Britain and France, for precisely the same reasons. Those countries cannot offer crypto deals to Trump's children, or to the children of Steve Witkoff, his foreign policy envoy, or to the children of Howard Lutnick, his commerce secretary. The Gulf states can. Where it gets very interesting, though, is on China, but perhaps we can, get into that later.
No, in fact, that would be my next question, Ed. Really, China is something that Trump thought, I think, that he understood. But his trade war with China is really something that China is perhaps benefiting from, and it isn't working out exactly as Trump thought.
It's not. I think he thought he had the bigger bazooka, and that was to deny China access to America's market, initially by these sky-high 145% tariffs, I think, back in April. China then started wielding its own bazooka, which is denying America and the West, well, the world, in fact, access to these rare earths and to certain critical minerals, all of which are absolutely key, not just to high-end civilian economy, but also to the military production process in the West. And that turned out to be a bigger bazooka than the Trump tariff bazooka. So we, after many iterations and lots of marching to the top of the hill and marching down again, we finally have this 1-year truce that Trump struck with Xi Jinping in Busan in South Korea at the G20 summit late October, which was in effect Trump climbing down, Trump being brought to heel. So we're left with, one moral from this story, which is if you've got leverage, you can defeat Trump. If you haven't got leverage, nothing much will stop him. And that, I guess that does conform with the jungle theory of how Trump approaches the world.
Right. And, when you look at China also, there's this other aspect of the AI race. And there's a lot of speculation about whether China is beating America in that AI race. And Trump seems quite focused on that as well, as do all the transglobal companies who are invested in AI. What's your sense of things?
So whether China or the United States is winning the AI race, I don't have a strong view. I've seen persuasive arguments on both sides of that. DeepSeek and the sort of much lower cost of building massive AI platforms, LLMs in China, versus where America's still got the most cutting edge AI processors, GPUs, etc. And, I don't know the answer to that. I do have some skepticism, though, of the premise of this argument, which is that whoever crosses the finishing line first is winner takes all, sweeps the world. It just strikes me as a little bit like a sort of one of those Marvel comic Hollywood movies that I don't think things are that simple. And I don't think, if one reaches AGI or super intelligence before the other, then that's it. It's game over. But a lot of Washington, really the sort of consensus in Washington, which isn't happy with Trump, does believe that this is a sort of winner takes all question of who crosses the finishing line first. So they're unhappy with Trump because part of the deal that he did with Xi Jinping is he's still permitting lots of high-end AI processors from the likes of NVIDIA to be exported to China. He's not really picked up, still less strengthened, this so-called small yard, high fence that the Biden administration devised to try and contain China from getting the most cutting edge of American technologies. Trump really isn't sort of in that space. He looks to the sort of mercantilist, commercial nature of deals, has quite an obsession with 20th century products like soybeans, old-fashioned commodity products, and purely the trade in goods side of the bilateral deficit. Services don't interest him. So he's got a very quirky and, dare I say it, analog era idea of what economic ties mean. So the blob, the foreign policy consensus in Washington, is very unhappy with him on China.
What about Russia? That personal friendship with Vladimir Putin didn't quite work out, did it?
It didn't.
He thought he was his friend.
He thought, he started by saying he'd fix the Ukraine-Russia war in 24 hours. Then he stretched it to 100 days. Then it became 200 days. And now I think finally the penny's dropped that Putin doesn't really want to end this war because he doesn't have enough to show for the million or so deaths and casualties that Russia has suffered in the last 3.5 years. That this is an existential sort of game for Putin, and he's not going to accept a frozen conflict, with Trump then saying, now finally I should get the Nobel Peace Prize because I've solved this biggest of all wars. I don't think he read Putin correctly. And the penny has dropped because, he was going to have a second summit. He had one, of course, in the summer in Alaska. And he was going to have another in Budapest in Hungary. And he realized that Putin wasn't going to wasn't really in the mood for a bargain that would end this war. And so he cancelled the summit. So that was the first real sign that, Trump's patience with Putin, or you might put it another way, cupidity about Putin, might be running out. But as I say, Trump's a capricious, unpredictable individual. So, what I'm saying now could be upended, before lunch.
Let's get back a little to our favorite Brzezinski. How would he have seen Trump treating China and Russia the way he does, and them actually coming closer together? Whereas I think his idea was to keep them divided.
Yes, I mean, I think, the sort of first rule of geopolitics, going back to, the ancient Chinese thinkers and people like Cortilier, I guess, the sort of idea of how you engage with other states is that you don't push all your enemies together, and you don't push your friends in with your enemies either. So, quite apart from Brzezinski, I would imagine being very concerned about this no limits partnership between China and Russia, he would also be pointing out that a lot of China's neighbors that are former allies of the United States are now pushing closer to China, at least on the commercial and trade and technology front, which is not a minor thing. It's kind of what makes the world tick. And so if you're pushing your friends and your enemies, together into an anti-American camp, well, then you're not doing geopolitics right. You're reducing America's leverage. You're certainly shattering its soft power. You're raising the cost of America getting its way. And you're creating the conditions for others to strike deals with each other because they don't trust the paper on which their deals with you being America, are written on. That, wouldn't require a Brzezinski or one of the sort of higher strategic brains to decode that this is not enlightened self-interest. This is quite self-harming. But I think Brzezinski, would be particularly cutting and efficient in pushing that point forward in today's Washington.
Yes, but I can't imagine he would survive for long, as you said earlier. Let's talk a little about domestic politics and really what's going on in America right now. There's the shutdown, there's the recent polls where the Democrats did very well, the rise of Zoran Mamdani, which, as you know, India was very interested in. How do you see the recent elections, and how do you view the rise of someone like Mamdani?
Yes, well, I was waiting for the headline Manhattan Masala because, that struck me as a really obvious one. But I guess it was a kind of obscure art house movie, and that probably wouldn't have resonated. But, the Mamdani phenomenon is a pretty extraordinary one. New York is the largest Jewish city in the world. It has more Jews than the full population either of Tel Aviv or Jerusalem. And a third of its Jewish voters voted for Mamdani, a guy, who's anti-Zionist. So this is a very interesting phenomenon. Now, I'm not sure they voted for him because of that. I think they voted for him in spite of that, because he captured not just the sort of sense that people are being priced out of their own city, that it's unaffordable, that this is really this is really a housing, cost of housing and other things crisis facing New York. But also, I think he tapped into pretty strong latent resentment against the levels of inequality that you find in today's America, and particularly, of course, in its more booming sections like New York. So in that respect, Mamdani is a really interesting phenomenon. I mean, I guess it's no accident his mother is such an accomplished movie maker, to see Mamdani mastering, the visual and optical arts and the sort of meme creation skills that he pioneered so well to win that race to be mayor of New York. But there were other elections. There was the governorship of Virginia. There was the governorship of New Jersey. There were various other races in places like Georgia and Pennsylvania and in California. And the winning candidates who won by just as Democratic candidates who won by just as big a margin as Mamdani did in New York, they came from a very different part of the Democratic Party, some of them, the centrist part. Some of them pro-Zionist, some of them anti-Zionist, but for the most part, sort of more centrist Democrats. And they won by similar margins. And what I think they all have in common is they're focusing on what Trump focused on when he defeated Kamala Harris, which is the cost of living, which is, I think it's kind of a heuristic for something bigger than just prices are too damn high. I think it also means inequality is reaching pretty absurd levels. And Trump's on the wrong side of that. He's now being, the weapons he deployed against the Democrats in 2024 are now being deployed equally successfully against Republicans. So he's in some difficulty.
There's also the shadow of the Epstein files. They don't seem to be going away. That's worrying for Trump, isn't it?
It's very worrying for Trump. I mean, he stoked, remember, the Epstein files as a big state, a deep state cover-up when Biden was president. And then gets to office, and this happened with a bunch of other issues. Then gets to office having sort of promised to blow open the hatchet and bring all this to light. And now he's doing everything possible not to. And so, if as he claims, these files prove his innocence, I can't think of too many other people in history who've gone to such lengths to suppress evidence of their own innocence. It's extraordinary. I mean, he does not want anything released. But his base, who was stoked up by him on this very issue, this very totemic issue about the deep state, they're not accepting that they've got to march down the hill again. They want to stay at the top of that hill, and they want these files released. And so Trump's kind of in a bind of his own making, which I think is common to populists. He promised sort of sweeping, absurd things. And then when you get to office, well, you've got to redeem them. And whether or not the Epstein files, have anything incriminating about Trump, I really don't know. But it is reasonable for people to get quite conspiratorial about Trump if he attempts to suppress them. So he's in a jam of his own making.
Which also brings me to a larger point about, in a sense, the end or the beginning of the end of the conventional politician. The Charlie Kirks of the world were replaced by, say, Nick Fuentes, and you have a whole lot of people, as you said, who followed Trump and perhaps would be swayed by someone who's equally unorthodox in his political messaging. Do you think we're nearing the era of the end of the conventional Washington sort of politician?
It's a good question. I mean, what we have with Nick Fuentes, who of course is until very recently was considered to be unhygienic, even on the MAGA right, because he's a full-blown sort of pro-Hitler, Holocaust denying far-right figure. The problem with sort of having a cordon sanitaire for people like him is if you're the rest of the MAGA movement, you're saying, well, immigrants are fair game, Muslims are fair game, brown people in general are fair game, gays are fair game, everybody's fair game, but we'll stop at the Jews. Well, you're going to get people saying, oh, why are we stopping at the Jews? I mean, everyone else is fair game. Well, let's carry on and include the Jews. And that's the point at which we've reached. And those who say, no, we stop at the Jews, don't really have logic on their side. And so they're losing the argument. So we're in a very dangerous moment where, and it's very generational. If you look, any Republicans in politics, I'm not talking about voters, I'm talking about the party, any Republicans under 35, 40 even, they're with Nick Fuentes. I mean, a growing plurality, possibly a majority. Republicans over 50 are not. But the Republicans over 50 have been riding this tiger up to this point. And now they're saying, no, and it has to stop here. They don't have much credibility in policing their own party because and I'm mixing metaphors here, but they've created this monster, this Frankenstein, and they've lost control of it.
Right. And I wonder who, the big question will be, who after Trump will lead the Republican Party?
So J.D. Vance his stance on this issue, this absolutely critical touchstone, is this debate over the sort of the Nazi right. Vance is giving them, it's nudge wink. He's not openly endorsing them, certainly isn't repudiating them though. So he's very much positioning himself to be the standard bearer of the new, far more sort of metastasized and menacing MAGA right as it is morphing into this sort of neo-Nazi position, which might make sort of, if you're an amoral, very ambitious person, might make sense just purely tactically within the movement. But if you want to win elections, most people aren't really motivated by this stuff. I mean, this is not what the average voter who, is worried about prices and is resentful of, the unaffordability of life and how others have it so good. They're not really looking to blame the Jews. I mean, it's a very sort of subcultural social media sort of far right meme factory, in which if you inhabit that world, you can think it's the world, but it's not really the world. Most people still live most of their lives offline, and so I mean, the direction I would say the Republican Party is going in this battle to be the sort of post-Trump heir, the successor, is both very dangerous. It's really quite lethal. But it's also quite sort of self-defeating. I mean, this isn't coalition building to sort of, win big elections with the general population. This is an inside party fight. And so it's getting more extreme, but it's getting less electable.
And we don't see much hope in the Democrats, do we? We don't see any clear leader, although there, of course, the Gavin Newsoms of the world, but doesn't seem to be any clear leader there.
There isn't, and this is just a function of having a presidential system. There is no leader of the opposition. So there is no sort of head to organize a collective response. So the Democratic Party seems to be not clueless, but it somewhat adrift, or at least it did until those off-year elections we were just talking about. That's been a real shot in the arm. It ended what I think was prolonged period of depression and breast beating and woe is me conversations on the American left, and now they sort of see a demonstration effect. Oh well, look, we can actually win elections, and Trump's really harming himself on the economy. We can't see how easily Trump would shift position, because if he wants to reduce inflation and make people feel flusher in their pocketbooks, he would have to climb down from all these tariffs. And tariffs are kind of at the core of how Trump does business. Not just his economic policy, but his foreign policy is basically about tariffs. So we've got a much rosier or a much less gloomy outlook than we thought we did. This is Democrats talking, than we thought we did 2 weeks ago. After the midterms, which if things carry on as they are, you are likely to see more Democratic wins, possibly regaining Capitol Hill. Actually, probably regaining Capitol Hill, then you'll get a very, very crowded Democratic presidential primary. There's going to be a lot of people auditioning to be the Democrat who beats Trump or whoever Trump's heir is in 2028. So I think this period in the wilderness is probably coming to an end for Democrats.
You talked about 2028. Let's talk about 2026, the 250th anniversary of America. There's a lot of stuff that Trump is planning, which seems to be quite regal in its ambition. Talk a little about what he plans and how you view it.
Yeah, well, I think we've been seeing during the government shutdown, that 6-week shutdown, what we saw was one of the things that continued to happen, or actually started, was Trump demolishing the east wing of the White House. I mean, just simply, there was no mapping of it, no attempt to preserve anything. They came in with wrecking balls and just demolished this historic wing of the People's House, as it is still called, in order to build a 650 capacity ballroom, presidential ballroom, that's called the Donald J. Trump Ballroom. And I think that's emblematic of his plans for the quarter millennium celebration of the American Declaration of Independence from 1776, that he's branding it as a Trump thing. And there's going to be all sorts of absolute horror expressed at the sort of glitziness and the gilt edge, the Mar-a-Lagification of America's hallowed traditions, and this extraordinary date, 250 years, that we still have a functioning republic. And, I don't think it's going to be undivisive, let's put it that way. He's branding it as a Trump event.
Yeah, that should be something that will be quite a spectacle, horror or otherwise. We didn't ask the Gaza question. We talked about the Jews. We didn't ask the Gaza question. Really, how do you think Trump has handled Gaza?
Well, we have this quotation marks ceasefire that Trump arranged, which involved Hamas returning the few living hostages left, and then the bodies of most of the remaining ones, the remains of them, of those hostages who died. And I think the assumption at the time was, Trump stared down Netanyahu. And that's something that Biden and indeed Obama and others and Trump previously have been unable to do. And that's all it requires, because Israel does depend hugely on the United States. And so the United States is the only country with leverage. And Trump did sort of ram it down Netanyahu's throat. He got Netanyahu to call the emir of Qatar to apologize for this strike a couple of weeks earlier that the Israeli Air Force had done on Hamas buildings in Doha. And so it looked like Trump was really doing something American presidents don't do very much, which is staring down Israel's leader. But so far that appears to be it. And the reason I put, inverted commas around the word ceasefire is that I think somewhere like 300 Palestinians have been killed in temporary lapses of the ceasefire since it happened. That's quite a lot of people. It's a far lower kill rate than we were seeing before the ceasefire. But it's not much of a ceasefire by everybody else's standards in other parts of the world. And at the same time, we're seeing a real intensification of Israeli settler incidents in the West Bank with Palestinians, and the sort of open debate going on in Israel about annexing both Gaza and the West Bank. So any idea that we're going to build a two-state solution out of this, I mean, we should already have been deeply skeptical of that when the ceasefire deal was announced. But any idea that Trump now has a sort of carefully planned, sustained, regionally coordinated Saudi-Israel normalization included two-state solution in mind is, I think, smoking something very potent.
Really, we're at the end of what I thought was quite a remarkable conversation. It's so much insight and information. I wonder, Ed, there used to be this letter from America by Alistair Cook on BBC, which we were all great fans of back in the day when we used to listen to BBC radio. Does being an Englishman give you a particular insight into the American mind in a way?
No, I don't think being an Englishman does.
Or an outsider, shall we say?
Yeah, I mean, I've been here, as you mentioned at the beginning, 20 years. And I did have a strange interlude in, an unorthodox interlude where I was in the year 2000, late 99, 2000, early 2001. I was speechwriter to the U.S. Treasury Secretary. So I've had sort of a little bit of insider experience. Now, I just think that, having been here quite a long time, but not being American, it sort of gives me some insider stroke outsider perspective that might, who I think it was G.K. Chesterton or maybe it was Kipling. Somebody said, what does he of England know who only England knows? Mm-hmm. I think you see your own country more clearly when you're outside of it, when you've lived abroad. But I also think you see a foreign country more clearly sometimes than people who are from there who have never lived abroad. And, America's it's a continent. And a lot of Americans haven't lived abroad. They find it hard to compare their country to others. And I think it's helpful to bring that comparative perspective.
Yes, we've seen you doing that in India as well. Thank you so very much, Ed. It was lovely talking to you, and all the best for Trump's America and living in it and living through it. Thank you so much.
That was a delight. Thank you.
Thank you.
We're now thrilled to welcome Joyeeta Gupta, Distinguished Professor of Environment and Development in the Global South at the University of Amsterdam and at the Institute for Water Education. An internationally respected scholar, she's a Spinoza Prize laureate, a member of the Netherlands Royal Academy of Sciences, and a leading voice in global climate governance through her work with the IPC, UNEP, and the UN's high-level groups on science, technology, and sustainable development. With decades of influential research, major international awards, and leadership roles across landmark environmental assessments, Gupta continues to shape global thinking on climate action and sustainable futures. Join us for this engaging exploration at the intersection of environment and development. As our guide, Vinayak Das Gupta will moderate this session.
Welcome to the 23rd edition of the Hindustan Times Leadership Summit. We are delighted to have with us Professor Joyeeta Gupta of University of Amsterdam. Our conversation today comes days after the world gathered at COP30 in Brazil. There, a familiar battle line emerged. Developing countries demanded climate justice, more finance, while wealthy nations resisted obligations on climate finance that they committed to delivering while seeking tougher cuts on emissions. At the heart of this divide is a question that Professor Gupta has spent 3 decades trying to answer. How do we share a finite planet fairly? Born in Delhi and educated at Lady Shri Ram College before going on to study at Harvard Law School, Professor Gupta has become one of the world's foremost voices on climate justice. Her 1997 PhD was among the first to systematically examine how rich and poor countries engage in climate negotiations, a tension that remains painfully relevant today. In 2007, she was a lead author of the IPCC report that won the Nobel Peace Prize alongside Al Gore, and their work to build and disseminate greater knowledge about man-made climate change. In 2023, she won the Spinoza Prize, often called the Dutch Nobel. And in 2022, she received the P.S. Sellers Prize for solution-focused climate research. But perhaps her most groundbreaking work came as co-chair of the Earth Commission, where she pioneered the concept of safe and just planetary boundaries. Currently, she serves as co-chair of the UN Secretary General's high-level group, advising on science and technology for sustainable development goals, and is leading an ambitious project to draft a global constitution for the climate change. Today, we discuss what 3 decades of climate negotiations have taught her and whether justice is still possible on a warming planet. Professor Gupta, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I want to start with something that is very recent. The climate conference just concluded in Brazil. This is perhaps the first time UN and other agencies have acknowledged that an overshoot of the 1.5 degree threshold is likely. And amid that, we have the same tensions playing out for the reluctance of a fossil fuel phase out on one hand, and the reticence by countries who committed to giving more money for the climate crisis on actually talking about deliverance. You have seen this for over 3 decades now. What do you make of the present?
Well, we basically have around 130 gigaton of carbon dioxide space left, and we guess that within the next 3 years, we will cross 1.5 definitively. Of course, 1.5 degrees centigrade is seen as the safe target because beyond that, we can trigger all kinds of tipping elements. And the discussion right now is, okay, can we come back to 1.5 degrees centigrade later in the century? And I think that is neither safe nor just. And that's one of the big problems, that we are not taking this storyline that there's very little CO2 emission space left seriously. And of course, we knew this in 1992. We knew then that at some point we have to get to zero. And this discussion of getting to zero has been problematized in some ways because governments have been talking about overshoot and they've been talking about net zero. So overshoot pushes the time limit to when you get to zero into the future. And net zero means you can continue to emit as long as you plant trees somewhere in the world to compensate or offset those emissions. And both these two narratives are actually problematic in my view. And unfortunately, in Belém, they more or less agreed that this overshoot is inevitable and net zero is inevitable. And they did not use the word fossil fuel at all. And that, to some extent, is a big weakness of the discussions there. But on the other hand, it also shows the strength of the multilateral system because 1,600 fossil fuel lobbyists were present in Belém. And they were very strong there. And basically, that's the reason the word fossil fuel doesn't show up. Now, this also means that the fossil fuel lobby sees the multilateral process as very important. And I do want to emphasize that because no matter how slowly the multilateral process moves, it is a very, very important process and we must stick to it. And on the finance side, it's always problematic because the more you delay action in the global north, the more you will have to pay, in fact, because the adaptation costs and loss of damage will go up. And so that becomes a problem for the global north, and it has not been adequately explained to people in the global north. And I'm afraid on this finance issue, people don't understand that if they don't pay up, everybody in the world will lose. And that's the story I'm trying to tell also global north countries.
We'll come back to finance in a bit as well. I wanted to get your sense on something specific about it. But I want to really get a sense from you. In 1997, I think when you were doing your research, when you first spoke about this North-South dynamic, you've been looking at this sort of asymmetry between what sort of negotiation powers different parties have play out over this very long period. How do you see this to have changed? Has it evolved into a bigger problem? Are there like some areas that have eased up? What's your view of that journey?
I think that the North-South issues were clearer and simpler in 1997 than they are today. And there are two reasons primarily for that. The first reason is, of course, that both the South has become a very complicated arena with countries that have been developing very fast, countries that have not been developing so fast. So there's a massive diversity within the South. And also in the North, there is a certain degree of a reluctance to participate in the negotiations, especially in North America. And that has created a bigger complication. But the biggest reason I see is the fact that the carbon budget in 1997 was much bigger. So sharing that carbon budget would have been easier if it had been discussed in 1992 or 1997. But as we move to 2015 and 2030, the budget has become so small that it's really difficult to talk about sharing that. And that has made the North-South battle even more complex. And of course, there's a third dimension, and that is that in the global North, there is also a South. There are poorer people in the global North that also suffer because of the lack of justice within the northern countries. But even in the global South, there is a global North. So there are rich people in the global South who overuse their budget in some ways, and there's a lack of justice within global South countries. And so you find that these three elements are really making the story today very different. So to sum up, the first problem is that the entire negotiation process has become more complex because the diversity in the South has become more, as well as the reluctance of North America in the North to participate in these processes. Second, the budget was much bigger. The CO2 budget was much bigger in 1992 and 1997. Now it's much smaller. So basically, equitably sharing this budget is really complex. And the third is there is a South in the global North, and there is a North in the global South. And that makes the issues of justice within the North and within the South pertinent to any discussion we have today.
And these rifts seem to be playing out in such tenuous manners in the negotiations from what we see. Because if we, for instance, take the whole debate about expanding the donor base, something that a lot of countries have sought and something that China, for instance, has really resisted. It is the world's second largest economy. And yet it's a developing economy with a lot of poverty and basic amenities that they need to address. And like you mentioned, that there is a global North in the global South and a global South in the global North. In that context, particularly when it comes to the debate about donor bases and financing, what are your thoughts? Is there a case to redefine that a little bit, or does it expand the risk of letting historical polluters off the hook very easily?
Well, I think primarily I would try to expand the finance discussion a little bit. So what we are seeing right now is that many developing countries are paying huge amounts of money in debt servicing, just normal debt servicing. And I have read papers that say that countries spend 5 times more in debt servicing on average than they spend on climate. So maybe there is a way to use debt for climate swaps and to learn from the lessons of the previous debt for nature swaps. That could be a way to generate resources for developing countries. Another way we could develop resources both for the global North governments and the global South governments is to do tax justice. So tax justice basically tries to counter tax avoidance and tax evasion. And some estimates are that around $500 billion are missed because of tax evasion and tax avoidance. And this would enable global North countries as well as global South countries to have more resources to fund the global commons, to fund issues of merit goods and the climate stability storyline. In addition to that, one could talk about compensation, and the compensation could come from, for example, the oil, gas, coal companies. There are a number of court cases against them, 160 court cases right now. None of the court cases have actually led to compensation, but I can imagine that compensation will become an issue in future court cases. That's another area where we could raise resources. Ultimately, I think what is really important is, especially in the context of the fact that official development assistance is going down in the global North. So it went down by 9% last year, and I believe it'll go down by 9% to maybe 13 or 14 or 15% this year. Now, if official development assistance is going down, there are two narratives. The first narrative is that with that, climate assistance from government will go down. The other narrative is that the official development assistance is going down to enable climate finance to go up, which basically means that the net amount of money the rich countries make available to developing countries will remain roughly the same. I don't know which of those two narratives will work out, but whether they work out or not, the total amount of money is pretty small compared to the 300 billion per year we are expecting to have by 2035, or up to 1.3 trillion, which is being discussed. So my gut feeling is that rich countries want to use this limited amount of money to create or leverage more money from the private sector. But the private sector will, unfortunately, when they invest or lend money to the global south, the cost of capital is high, and that might lead to greater debt in the global south. And for me, that is a really big problem. So I think it's very important that we try to see if through debt for climate swaps, if through tax justice, if there are other alternatives that we can use to raise the resources. But also, I will keep pushing the narrative over here that rich countries need to pay much more, and it should be much more grant than loans.
This sounds like one of the fundamental shifts, if not fundamental, a very significant shift in the funding dialogue that has happened over maybe the latter half of the 30-year period that we are talking about. I want to get your sense about the political will to enable this, because when we talk about compensation, when we talk about getting the private, whether it's the compensation aspect or voluntary contributions or whatever methods the private sector might contribute to it, what sort of challenge do we see in sort of the politics of it? Our countries, is like you mentioned the oil lobbies at the conference. Is this a threat that's growing?
Well, politically, I think across the world, governments come for 4 to 5 years in democratic countries, and most of them just want to maintain the system, maintain the status quo. They don't want to rock the boat. So the chances that there is a political willingness to undertake action is quite low. My hope is a little bit on the judiciary and on the social movements, because the social movements are creating the narratives, and they're building their narratives based on science, and then they're going to the courts. And the courts are bringing science back into the discussion. So in some ways, the politics is focusing more on certain types of narratives, which pleases their voters. But when you go to a court, the court will focus on what is a fact, what is science. And based on that, they're coming up with some positions. And now I'm talking about courts that have not become politically motivated. And so what you're seeing with the three advisory opinions of the international courts, so the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, Court on Human Rights, and the International Court of Justice, these three courts have provided some advice about climate change. Basically, together they say that 1.5 degrees centigrade is the legally binding target. The NDCs should add up to 1.5 degrees centigrade, that countries should be, could be held, I should use the right words, if they continue to use fossil fuel, that could be seen as an international wrongful act, that states are responsible to make sure that the actors within their own countries do not create problems, and states themselves should not cause significant harm to others. And of course, they also say CO2 is a pollutant. So all these elements that are coming out from the international courts, as well as from the national courts worldwide, that gives me hope. I believe that the courts may try to balance the power of politics. And so this is one way we can move this storyline. And of course, what we're talking about is justice for the 99%. The 1% is going to resist that. But the social movements and civic society and journalists have such an important role to push this narrative forward, because the only way we can get justice in this, and I'm talking also about the people in the global north that are not so well off, the only way we can do this is if the 99% stands up for their rights. And that's a political battle that has to be fought.
is that a political battle or a legal judicial conversation that's reaching global South parts just yet? Because you mentioned the international courts, and it seems that Europe, for instance, has had a lot of this. You've both from a legal and judicial perspective. But tell us a little bit about what you see and what more needs to be done up in addition to what you mentioned.
So basically what you're seeing is across the world, even in the global south, there are a large number of court cases on climate change and also against fossil fuel companies. And the narrative is different from continent to continent. So in Latin America, the narrative is much more about the violation of the human rights of the people there. And so that story is being pushed quite strongly. In Africa, you're seeing a lot of court cases where the storyline is that the environment impact assessments are not being correctly done, the permits are not being correctly issued, and so it's a procedural story there. In the Philippines, you have the Commission on Human Rights that came out with a statement which was that even if fossil fuel companies are not located in the Philippines, if their activities cause damage to Philippines citizens, then they can be held accountable for that. So you're seeing across the board court cases occurring. Now, these court cases are trying to both limit the use of fossil fuel in some ways, and they're also trying to come up with some statements about fossil fuel companies. So I think that the courts are important, but it is also the social movements, because the social movements create the pressure also on the courts to think in a particular way. You're also educating. 2 days ago, I was in a meeting of lawyers and judges and diplomats in the Netherlands. And we were discussing the fact that in some ways, even judges get influenced by the narratives of the fossil fuel companies, because the narratives of the fossil fuel companies, they promote disinformation, malinformation, misinformation, and they have so much money. It's in the press the whole time. The social media spreads this information. Newspapers echo that information. And then judges hear that. And then they think, oh, energy security means that in the global north, we must continue to use fossil fuel. But that's not the case, because energy security, environmental security, and prosperity can be achieved through renewables. So in many ways, we have to start to try to undermine the disinformation that is coming out. That's the number one security risk, according to the World Economic Forum. And across the world, we are seeing this disinformation happening today, and that we have to fight a lot.
That's a very interesting point with the information sanctity that you mentioned. I wanted to touch on something related. When we talk about will to act or to take steps forward in climate action, especially on what sort of energy we use, I wanted to ask your view on what's happened in the last 5 years, especially its impact on the collective action aspect. I particularly referring to what happened during the pandemic, where you saw this tendency of resource guarding, resource hoarding come up. That was an acute crisis, and it seemed that people with resources, their first one of the first motivations was to hoard. We had countries hoarding vaccines to inoculate their populations 3 times over. Then you had the invasion in Ukraine and the energy insecurity problems that immediately came up. You had some dirty power plants being reopened, or the sunsetting of some of the coal or fossil fuel based energy infrastructure being pushed back. So are we taking some steps back?
So I'm going to go back and answer this question slightly differently. So basically what I said earlier is that 30 years ago, the carbon budget was quite big. And as we move towards 2030, the carbon budget is shrinking to 0. That means we are all fighting about who has the right to use fossil fuel, who has the right to emit greenhouse gases. Now, if you are a neoliberal capitalist, your answer is to try to price carbon, and you're trying to use the markets to allocate the right to use fossil fuels and the right to emit emissions. And that leads to this entire market-based approach. If you are an hegemonist, then you basically want to hoard. You want to say, I'm going to do whatever I can within my own country to maximize the use of my resources, and I'm not going to share responsibility with others. And that's your hoarding story from the COVID narrative. And this hegemonic response is what you're seeing currently in very powerful countries of the world that are moving out of the climate change negotiations. So what they're trying to then do is, there is a small budget. I don't want to get involved in that. I'm going to use all the fossil fuel in my own country, and I'm going to go ahead and I don't care. Now, the hegemonic response is also very problematic. Now, there is also the polycentric response, which is Elinor Ostrom's storyline that there are multiple centers of governance. Now, I agree with that, but I don't think it'll solve the problem because, so let me go back and try and explain this a little bit better. A neoliberal capitalist approach basically says we need to protect individual freedom, freedom of the markets, deregulate, and have tiny governments. But the climate change problem is not a problem of individuals. It's a collective problem. So basically, we're talking about how do we not talk about individual freedom, but how do we maximize collective freedom by restricting some of this freedom? It's not about free markets. It's about regulating free markets. And it's not, small governments cannot maintain the climate stability. You need governments that have enough checks and balances within the system, but enough resources to maintain the climate stability. And currently, I think that whole neoliberal capitalist system is just not going to solve the problem. And neither is retreat into my country first narratives. So basically, what we're trying to do is promote deepened multilateralism. And you did see that deepened multilateralism is under attack through the war in Ukraine, but also through the fact that countries are reducing their contributions to the UN system. But I think that's not going to solve this problem. We really have to have much more collaboration with each other. And this is not just a North-South problem. In many ways, even for a country like India, it's important to see what will happen when Africa calls for its right to development. So, we have to think more broadly about our collective common futures. So all governments need to do that. And that's really a challenge.
I want to, since we spoke about the future possibility of what happens when even countries that are far at the beginning of their development trajectory start to invoke the same sort of privileges, or not privileges, or at least the necessities that developing countries like India right now are claiming. In that sense, what do you expect, or what would your wish list be in terms of the NDCs that India has yet to update? Or at least what you've seen till now and what you
so for me, I want to go back a little bit and say 1.5 degrees centigrade is not, in my view, the just target. In my view, the just target is 1 degree centigrade. That is what we wrote about in the Earth Commission. We got it published in Nature. We presented it to the World Economic Forum plenary. Why do we see 1 degree centigrade as the just target? Because you can try to limit damage to less than 1% of the global population. And as you go towards 1.5, the degree of people who will be seriously affected goes up. And as you move on to 1.5 plus, which is sort of coming back to 1.5 at the end of the century, will have massive more damage, and at 2 degrees, much more damage. And of course, this is irreversible, and it is into the next few centuries. So it will cause huge damage to India. The heat that India will face, the melting of the glaciers that India will experience, the high wet bulb temperatures that will expose people to extreme health. This is going to be a real big problem. And also saltwater intrusion, extreme weather events. It's not a joke. It's going to be very, very expensive for countries of the global south. So for me, the question over here is, are we going to focus on protecting people today and into the future? Are we going to focus on using fossil fuel? So let's talk about fossil fuel. 78% of the fossil fuel is in the global south. If the global south makes the argument that we will use our fair share when the global north did not leave its fair share, now that's a very logical argument, and I hear this very often. But if they use that, everybody loses. And so the question is, can developing countries leapfrog? So they need to leapfrog intellectually, so go beyond this neoliberal capitalist idea to much more deepened multilateralism, a completely different economy. So intellectually, they have to leapfrog. Technologically, they have to leapfrog. They have to leave the fossil fuel underground and see, can we use the sun that we have to get to a much better renewable energy system? And they have to move forward in terms of institutions. They have to leapfrog institutionally. And if they can do that, then they're okay. So when Africa is going to develop and when it says, we have discovered new fossil fuel and we want to use this new fossil fuel to enhance GDP, that it is their right to say that. But my argument to them would be, can you leapfrog? Can you jump ahead? Can you not get stuck in the fossil fuel world, because that's going to affect you much more? And this is also a question for India. We have a colleague from India who's written a paper for us, and he shows us the fiscal dependence of the Indian system on the fossil fuel storyline. And how can we unpack that fiscal dependence and try to create a new narrative? And this requires brain power. It requires intellectuals in India, but also in the West, to sit down and think about these issues. Let me give you another story. I cannot prove it. I only have anecdotal evidence, but I have heard that many rich countries don't tell their people that there will be serious impacts in the global north, because that might reduce their AAA rating for foreign investors. So in some ways, what they're trying to do is to pretend there is no problem so that investment will keep coming into their countries. And now they're trying to tell investors, we are adapting so fast that no matter what happens, we can adapt, which is not true, in order to keep that AAA rating. So governments are playing all kinds of games in different parts of the world. And we need to go beyond that. We need the civil servants who have a longer term perspective than the politicians to push the agenda. We need a coalition of science, civil servants, the health sector, because health is going to be one of those areas that's very badly impacted by climate change and also by fossil fuel, by just the PM 2.5 in your lungs. We need these sectors to come together to help social movements. We need progressive journalists to come together and to push the idea. And when I'm speaking, I'm always often told, oh, you guys are left wing. And I'm thinking, when the storm comes, it's not going to hit just the left wing people. Science is not left wing or right wing. Science is for everybody. And environmental issues affects the entire economy. Business doesn't seem to understand in the global north, in my view, that the value chain of production will be affected if the rains don't fall somewhere, if the heat goes up so much that labor cannot function. The entire value chain will suffer. And so if business starts to understand that, if banks start to understand that there is a risk for business, then you may see changes coming up. But there are so many different false narratives that are going around, and that is what we have to fight.
So essentially, we're fair, if I'm getting this right, we're fair to seek the fair headroom to grow, but we also need to be a little more ambitious, because the lower the carbon budget that we eat into, the better for all of us,
Yes.
whether or not it's fair.
And India, unlike, say, a small island state, India has the intellectual capacity. India has the IITs and the IIMs. It has a massive number of people all over the world with expertise. So India, if it could sit together, the leapfrogging is a possibility. But you also have to make sure that it doesn't become a technocratic story. Because I can tell you, in Europe, the energy transition has been presented as a technocratic story. Like, if you can get the solar panels, it's okay. But that's not true, because the poorer people cannot afford the solar panels or the wind power. And so then they get very angry about the fact that the rich people are getting subsidized to participate in the transformation, but they are not. So you have to make it a mass movement. You have to tell everybody in society, here comes the energy transformation. And of course, let's take cars. 95% of the time, cars are parked. And so essentially you can do with half the number of cars. That will reduce the amount of land you need for roads. It'll make more space for green areas. Your cars will go faster. And maybe with shared transport, we can do the same amount of kilometers. But also you need to invest much more in public transport. And so that narrative also has to come out. We have to move towards the era of shared goods and commodities, washing machines. You don't wash your clothes that often. Can you share the machines? Garden tools. Can you share that? We need to move towards the sharing era. And so essentially what I'm saying is India has, and many other developing countries, has the need to find the intellectual visioning to be able to leapfrog. And it's not a slightly more ambitious, it's a much more ambitious story I'm talking about. Because with a incremental story, you're not going to be able to solve the problems. And also we've left it too far. For 35 years, we've just sat and those arguments I hear from developing countries today are pretty close to the arguments I heard 35 years ago.
Just to switch into something else that you've been also very central to. Tell us a little bit about your planetary boundaries work. What struck me there was that it didn't just define safe limits based on science, but also safe and just limits.
So what
based on
happened was
fairness.
that when we were talking about the safe planetary boundaries, some of us social scientists, we argued, but those safe boundaries are not just because they cause huge harm to people, communities, countries, etc. And so with that narrative, we started to work on what is a just boundary. So then for climate change, we came to 1 degree centigrade. For air pollution, we were looking at the global planetary boundary, which we felt was not taking into account the PM 2.5 story at the local level. So there we tried to use WHO standards to strengthen the global air pollution boundary. And of course, with water and all the rest, we were trying to say you need to focus on just boundaries that do not cause harm to others. And so that's a story we're still trying to develop because we haven't developed it in all the areas. And the second question was, a lot of people think, that we can meet the social SDGs without changing our own behavior. Getting people to get access to energy, water, food, etc. is possible because they want to get 3 bulbs in a refrigerator, that's fine, but it won't affect my behavior. But what we show is that, in fact, if you meet the basic needs of people worldwide in 2018, pre-COVID, that would lead to a 26% increase in CO2 emissions because it has a footprint. And therefore, the argument is when you meet minimum needs, it could either be made by existing fossil fuel or it should be met by renewables or something else, because otherwise you lock yourself into the fossil fuel narrative. And fossil fuel is almost always longer than a 30-year period. So, that's the lock-in story. So then we were arguing that this is very important, that we should meet this with other issues. But then we went to the next step. We looked at the just boundaries, and then we reserved a certain amount of the space inside to meet the minimum needs of everybody worldwide. So everybody gets 3 bulbs in a refrigerator, for example, or a certain amount of food with a certain energy footprint. So then you reserve that space. And then there's a very tiny space left over. And that's what we published in Lancet Planetary Health. And then the question is, how do we divide that space? But today we are way outside. And what this basically means is if you earn a lot of money, it doesn't mean you can then spend it, because then you're way outside your footprint. You have to be very careful about how you spend it and that makes money less relevant, because if you cannot spend it on all these kinds of things, then the need to have the money is also less relevant. So anyway, that was the story that we were trying to push there. And that was our justice story. It was Earth system justice is needed for all of us to be able to live within these boundaries.
So these stories, which from my understanding, there's a lot of nuance that needs to be out there. And this seems like an effort in putting across a nuance that goes beyond a 1.5 or a 1 degree or 2 degree number. In that context, I want to understand the global constitution for the climate age that you're working on. Is that trying to do something similar? Can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Yes. So let's just give a simple example from climate change. So when you look at the international arena, and I'm doing this really simply, you will find that private contracts and investment contracts have a very high status. Then the environment treaties come somewhat below that. And way below that, you get the human rights agreements. This is the way the world treats this. So, for example, if you have to close down a fossil fuel plant and there is a long-term contract, the fossil fuel plant can demand compensation from the government, right? And under the Energy Charter Treaty, for example, foreign companies can demand compensation if the government tries to close it down. So that's the strength of that contractual relationship, which is very high. In the International Court of Justice's advisory opinion, they basically say that environmental and human rights issues should be brought together at the same level and treated at the same level. So that's part of the story. But what I want to do is to go a step further and say, even contracts that have all these relationships between people should also take into account human rights and environmental issues. So basically, I'm trying to change how the legal system functions at the global level. But also, let's take the economic system. The economic system, in my view, is also problematic. So I don't want to take a loan where I have to pay interest of more than 4 or 5%. But when you look at microcredit, the poorest guys pay interest, which is much higher. And then the banks argue that that's because the transaction cost is higher. If you take, let's say, loans from global north to global north and south, then you know sometimes if you lend money to Germany, it's 6% interest. If you lend the money on the same project to Tanzania, it's 24% interest. Now, the argument is that Germany will pay back, so this is fine. But then to charge Africa more when it cannot even pay back 6% does not make sense to me. But somehow it makes sense to the bankers. So there is a problem with the financial system. And that is also something I would like to tackle. And of course, the idea of inequality. Inequality, in my view, if it is extreme, is incompatible with democracy. Because if you have very rich people, they can tamper with the elections, as we have seen from the news. And very rich people can always lobby, etc. Very poor people are so busy with their daily survival that they don't have the ability to participate in democratic systems properly. They don't have the ability to separate fake news from news, fact from misinformation. And so you really need to have a society with less inequality, both north-south, but also within societies. That's the economic story. And then there's a technological story. If I have a saw, I can cut one tree. If I have a massive machine, I can cut a forest. If I have one dam, no big problem. If I have thousands of dams, the salmon cannot swim upwards. And now we have AI. Maybe AI can solve some problems, but large language models use huge amounts of energy. So the question over here is, and of course, let's take the frying pan. The non-stick frying pan had PFAS in it. Why? Why did we allow that? So what, and we have the tools for standards to check all these products. So my argument is that products and technologies that enter the market should not be allowed without a check on their long-term impacts on the system. So these are some of the areas. And we have an open science justice lab. And basically, we are inviting anybody and everybody above the age of 10. If you're a minor, your parents have to give permission to send us an essay of 1,000 words about the world you want to live in. And then the ideas in those essays are taken on board by us. So we are trying to, and of course, the essay writers become contributing authors to the draft global constitution. Now, this is not a formal process. This is a scientific process, but we are trying to create bottom-up legitimacy by trying to get as many contributing authors from the world, and they can write in any language. We hope we can get translations, and then we will try to create a story from bottom up about the world we want to live in.
Ask a final question, and I know we just spoke about nuance, so I'm a little wary of being reductionist here. But if you could implement one binding commitment tomorrow, whether on finance, fossil fuel phase out, loss and damage compensation, on something completely different, that would change the power dynamic between, especially keeping in mind justice outcomes that we spoke about. What would that sort of one move that you would really
I think it would be to strengthen, to ensure that the overshoot is as tiny as possible on top of 1.5. If rich countries go beyond 1.5, that's so if they emit beyond a certain level, then they are in overdraft. That is recognized. And that little overshoot is then equitably divided between developing countries. And the reason I'm saying this is because if you can close down the fossil fuel emission process, you can reduce the injustices for the next few centuries. So I think that is highly critical. So I would focus on closing the tap first before we try to solve all the other issues.
Right. Thank you. That's a very important insight in terms of at least drilling it down to distilling it to what really is very relevant right now. Thank you so much, Professor Gupta, for being with us today, and wish you all the best.
Thank you so much for your interview.
And that brings us to an end of the virtual sessions of the 23rd edition of the Hindustan Times Leadership Summit. We thank you for joining us and hope you will be also with us all through Saturday as we get ready for a power-packed day featuring Prime Minister Narendra Modi, S. Jaishankar, Nirmala Sitharaman, Hugh Grant, Amir Khan, Sunil Bharti Mittal, among many more distinguished speakers. Join us live on hindustantimes.com for an extraordinary day of ideas, leadership, and transformative conversations. See you there.
I am the future that was born 100 years ago. I am the purpose that emerged with India's independence to be a force for business that makes doing good our business. Towards an independence where knowledge sets us free. To think big and achieve bigger. To take India to the world and the world to India. Creating pathways of self-reliance. To stand for progress, the planet and the people. Towards a future made perfect. And be a force creating abundance. Because independence is not a moment in history. It's a never-ending path to prosperity. Aditya Birla Group, a force for good.
कस्टमर लॉयल्टी रिवॉर्ड 55 इंच का टीवी 4,999 रुपए में. Too good to be true.
Unknown company, unknown sender. यानी पक्का स्कैम. केस सॉल्व्ड.
करेक्ट. स्कैम के खिलाफ गूगल के साथ आओ. स्कैम पहचानो, मौका कमाओ.
Imagination in flight begins with a sheet of paper, a couple folds, and a simple throw. But for some, the exhilaration and wonder behind flight never fades. At GE Aerospace, we turn what-ifs into what's next. Because when the right idea catches the wind, there's no limit to how far the next generation will go.
In every step, there's a spark of joy. A little sparkle. Through laughter, through friendship, through streets that tell 1,000 stories. With Bata, make your way to the moments that matter. With Brighter Moments collection. This festive season, style begins at ₹799. Bata, Make your way. Visit your nearest Bata store.
UP on the rise, सुन ले आसमां, डबल इंजन का ये मिशन महान, 2047 तक हम न रुकेंगे, 6 ट्रिलियन का ड्रीम पूरा करेंगे। मथुरा की गलियों में गूंजे है राधा, अयोध्या में दूर हुई मंदिर की बाधा, काशी प्रयागराज की गोल्डन चमक, यूपी सरकार की गूंजे धमक, सड़कों पर फर्राटा फिक्रलेस बिल्कुल बिंदास, एक्सप्रेस वे पर साए पूरा विश्वास, विकसित यूपी की बढ़ गई प्यास, 2047 का ये विजन बहुत खास, माफिया का दी एंड, फियर गॉन, योगी राज में लॉ एंड ऑर्डर हुआ स्ट्रॉन्ग, बेखौफ घूमे जनता, गुंडों पर मार, नया यूपी तोड़ रहा पुरानी दीवार। यूपी ऑन द राइज, सुन ले आसमां, डबल इंजन का ये मिशन महान, 2047 तक हम न रुकेंगे, 6 ट्रिलियन का ड्रीम पूरा करेंगे।
Blessed with breathtaking natural beauty, vibrant tribal culture, and rich heritage its identity. Where there are vast reserves of mineral wealth, the new growth engine of New India, writing a new saga of development under good governance. Chhattisgarh, a state like no other, from Bastar to Sarguja. Chhattisgarhia, sable badhiya.
NPS वात्सल्य, ये किसने दिया?
ये हमने दिया है। सभी चाहते हैं अपने बच्चों की आज की नहीं, कल की जरूरतों को भी पूरा करें। इसीलिए हमने चुना है NPS वात्सल्य, जो सालाना 1000 रुपए के निवेश से भी शुरू हो जाता है।
NPS वात्सल्य आप 18 वर्ष तक के बच्चों के लिए ले सकते हैं, जो 18 वर्ष बाद खुद ही NPS अकाउंट में कन्वर्ट हो जाएगा।
इसीलिए कहता हूँ, हर उम्र के लिए NPS जरूरी है।
There are moments in a nation's journey when the sunlight awakens a new dawn of possibilities. As India stood at a crossroad of need and possibility, REC emerged, not as a company, but as a quiet resolve. REC was incorporated to resurrect the agriculture sector by energizing irrigation pump sets, marking a giant leap for the Indian agrarian economy. Since then, we have diversified into new technologies and financed over 100,000 megawatt of energy. We are now one of the biggest financial institutions in the country, funding generation, transmission, distribution, and renewable energy projects. The future is now, and we are constantly reinventing ourselves to stay ahead of the times.
As India strides towards the vision of Viksit Bharat at 2047, CGEW-HO stands committed to building not just homes, but a foundation of dignity, welfare, and inclusive progress for the backbone of our nation, our central government employees. This year's theme, Urban Solutions to Crisis, speaks directly to the heart of CGEW-HO's mission, a mission they've upheld for over 35 years, and that is to serve those who serve the nation. From its inception, CGEW-HO has seen housing not just as infrastructure, but as a right, a vital foundation for inclusive and dignified urban living. With a pan-India footprint, CGEW-HO has successfully delivered quality housing projects across the nation, from metros to emerging cities, ensuring that central government employees have access to secure and affordable homes wherever duty takes them.
I would say that dedicated freight corridor is the jewel of Indian Railways.
India dreamt of a new future with a faster, safer and smarter freight network. A vision to create a dedicated pathway for the nation's lifeline, its cargo. That vision became a mission. Dedicated freight corridors.
उगती हुई हरियाली में, सोने सी हर बाली में, हर सुबह चाय की प्याली में और घर घर की खुशहाली में, प्रदूषण मुक्त हो आसमान, दुनिया भर में अपने निशान, आत्मनिर्भर हिंदुस्तान, खेल इंडिया जिसकी पहचान।
Every great journey begins with a resolute step. India's journey in infrastructure started with early recognition of its importance, which gained traction from the mid-2000s onwards. Established in 2006 by the Government of India, India Infrastructure Finance Company Limited or IIFCL finances key infrastructure projects from roads and power to renewable energy, airports, seaports and urban development. IIFCL, funding foundation of the future.
तू ही मेरी एक वजह है, तू ही मेरी ऊर्जा है, तू ही मेरी राहों का नूर, तू मेरा फ्यूल हो, तुझी से मैं चलता हूँ, तेरे लिए जलता हूँ, तुझी से मैं हुआ मशहूर।
उत्तर के पहाड़ों से दक्षिण के किनारों तक, पहले इंडियन, फिर ऑयल, इंडियन ऑयल।
प्लीज विद्या मेरी मदद कर दे। पहले मेरा स्कूल बैग उठाना पड़ेगा, पक्का। स्कूल प्रोजेक्ट बनाना है ग्रीन एनर्जी पर, और मुझे कुछ नहीं पता। ग्रीन एनर्जी मतलब रिन्यूएबल एनर्जी, जैसे सोलर और विंड एनर्जी।
With the aim to achieve half of installed capacity from clean energy sources, we are creating a greener future because every step we take nature along.
मेरा बैग।
From oil-rich lands where dreams ignite, Oil India Limited fuels the nation day and night. As India's flag bearer in oil and natural gas exploration, we have been powering dreams for over 60 years. With operations spanning 7 countries, we drive industries, energize economies, and spark innovation. Rooted in legacy, committed to sustainability, we are building futures, uplifting communities, and empowering generations. A Maharatna of India, proud and true, Oil India Limited. energizing lives for you.
RVNL today has evolved into a global infrastructure powerhouse, laying the foundations of a future-ready India. From railways to metros, from highways to harbors, from tunnels to solar power, RVNL is transforming the infrastructure landscape across India and beyond. From concept to commissioning, Rail Vikas Nigam Limited, empowering progress, delivering excellence.